The Gambian story that broke a nation's heart. Welcome to the channel. This is our very first video, and I want to welcome you to a channel that is dedicated to telling stories about the Gambia. Here we are going to talk about everything Gambian. We will talk about Gambian politics. We will talk about the history of our country. We will talk about the people who shaped the Gambia. We will talk about sports, entertainment, culture, society, and the stories that sometimes don't receive enough attention. This is a channel where we want to learn about our country together. And today, for our very first story, we are going back to one of the most painful chapters in Gambian history. The story of Dawda Kairaba Jawara, the story of Yahya Jammeh, the story of the 1994 military coup, and the story of what happened to a country that once appeared to be one of the most peaceful democracies in Africa. So if you are Gambian, if you love the Gambia, if you are interested in Gambian history, or if you simply want to understand what happened to this small country in West Africa, stay with me. And before we begin, if you enjoy Gambian stories and you want to follow this journey with us, please subscribe to the channel. This is our first video and your support would mean a lot. Now, let's begin. Imagine a small country surrounded almost completely by another country. A country known for its rivers, its beaches, its hospitality, its music, and the warmth of its people. A country that, for many years, was considered one of the more peaceful places in Africa. But behind that peaceful image was a story of political frustration, military anger, fear, disappearances, exile, and a long struggle for freedom. This is the story of the Gambia. It is the story of a country that moved from the leadership of Sir Dawda Kairaba Jawara to the rule of Yahya Jammeh. And it is not simply a story about two presidents. It is a story about a nation that wanted democracy, a nation whose soldiers wanted change, a nation whose families wanted answers, and a nation that would spend more than 2 decades trying to recover from the consequences of one military coup. Before Yahya Jammeh became the powerful ruler that many people remember today, the Gambia was led by Dawda Kairaba Jawara. Jawara was not a military dictator. He came to represent the Gambia through a parliamentary political system, and after independence from Britain, he became the country's first president. For many Gambians, Jawara represented stability. He was a quiet, diplomatic figure. The Gambia was small, poor, and surrounded by Senegal, but it managed to maintain a reputation for political stability. There were elections, there were political parties, there was a civilian government. There was a sense that, despite the country's difficulties, the Gambia could continue building its future peacefully. But peace on the surface does not always mean that everybody is happy underneath. There were serious economic problems, there were complaints about corruption, there were frustrations within the military, and there were people who believed that the political system was failing ordinary Gambians. Then came a moment that changed the country forever. A group of young soldiers decided that they had had enough. They did not come with the traditional language of political campaigns. They came with guns. They came with military vehicles. They came with the belief that they were going to remove an old political system and replace it with something better. One of the young officers at the center of this movement was a relatively unknown lieutenant named Yahya Abdul Aziz Jemus Junkung Jammeh. He was young, he was a soldier, and he was about to become the most powerful man in Gambian history. The military takeover happened in July 1994. President Dawda Jawara was outside the country when the coup began. The government was overthrown. The democratic system was suspended. And suddenly, the country that had spent years under civilian rule found itself under military authority. For ordinary Gambians, it was a frightening moment. Imagine waking up and hearing that the government has fallen. Imagine hearing that soldiers have taken control. Imagine not knowing what will happen to your family. Imagine watching armed men occupy places that previously belonged to civilian institutions. Imagine wondering whether the country you knew yesterday still existed today. The young soldiers called their new governing body the Armed Forces Provisional Ruling Council, and Yahya Jammeh emerged as its chairman. He was only in his 20s. A young military officer had suddenly become the ruler of a country. At first, some Gambians welcomed the coup, and this is important to understand. Not everyone saw Jammeh as a monster at the beginning. Some people saw him as a young man who had promised to clean up corruption. Some believed that the old political establishment had become too comfortable. Some believed the military could bring discipline. Some believed the new rulers would create a better Gambia. There were promises. There was hope. There was also uncertainty. And that uncertainty would become one of the defining emotions of the Jammeh era. The soldiers promised that they would eventually return the country to democracy. But political power has a dangerous quality. Once people obtain it, they do not always want to give it back. The military government remained. Political activity was restricted. The country entered a new chapter, and the young soldier who had taken power began transforming himself from a military officer into a political leader. Eventually, Yahya Jammeh became president. The uniform changed, the language changed, the government changed, but the military influence remained at the heart of the new political order. And this is where the story becomes darker. Because the question was no longer simply, why did the soldiers overthrow Jawara? The question became, what happens when the soldiers refuse to leave? The Gambia had entered military rule, and for many years, Jammeh would remain at the center of power. There were elections, there was a political system, there were official institutions. But critics, journalists, opposition politicians, human rights activists, and ordinary citizens increasingly spoke about fear. Fear of criticizing the government, fear of security forces, fear of being watched, fear of being arrested, fear of disappearing, fear of saying the wrong thing. And perhaps the saddest part of any authoritarian system is that eventually people can become afraid even of their own words. A person may not need to be arrested to become frightened. Sometimes all it takes is seeing what happened to somebody else. A journalist disappears, an activist is arrested, a political opponent is threatened. A family waits for a relative who never comes home, and people begin learning a terrible lesson. Stay quiet. Do not ask questions. Do not attract attention. Do not challenge the powerful. A message to our first viewers. If you are still watching, thank you. Seriously, this is our first video on this channel, and I want this channel to become a place where Gambians can come to learn, remember, debate, and understand our country. We are not only going to talk about politics. We are going to talk about Gambian history. We are going to talk about sports. We are going to talk about entertainment. We are going to talk about culture. We are going to talk about important people and important events. And sometimes we are going to talk about stories that are difficult. Because our history is not only made of happy moments, so if you want to be part of this journey, subscribe to the channel. And if you are Gambian and you're watching this from the Gambia, Senegal, Europe, America, Asia, or anywhere else in the world, welcome. This channel is for you. Now let's continue. That is the tragedy of political fear. It does not always arrive with a gun. Sometimes it arrives as silence. People stop speaking. People stop asking questions. People begin watching what they say, and eventually, an entire society can learn to live with fear. For the Gambia, some of the darkest stories of the Jammeh era involved people who disappeared or were allegedly killed by state-linked forces. There were allegations of torture. There were reports of arbitrary detention. There were attacks on journalists. There were accusations of extrajudicial killings. There were stories of families who spent years looking for answers. And when a person disappears, the suffering does not disappear with them. It moves into the family. It sits at the dinner table. It enters the bedroom. It follows mothers, it follows fathers, it follows children. A mother may continue asking, "Where is my son?" A wife may continue asking, "Where is my husband?" A child may grow up asking, "Why did my father never come home?" These are not political statistics. These are human lives. Behind every number is a face. Behind every disappeared person is a family. And behind every political crisis are ordinary people who never asked to become part of history. The Jammeh government also became associated with hostility toward independent journalism. Journalists are supposed to ask uncomfortable questions. They are supposed to investigate. They are supposed to challenge politicians. But when journalism becomes dangerous, truth becomes dangerous too. Some Gambian journalists were arrested. Some were forced into exile. Some were attacked. Some were killed. And others simply stopped speaking. Imagine being a journalist and knowing that one article could put your life at risk. Imagine receiving a phone call late at night and wondering whether someone is coming for you. Imagine leaving your homeland because you believe staying could get you killed. That is the tragedy of exile. You may escape physically, but part of you remains behind. Your mother is there. Your father is there. Your childhood home is there. Your language is there. Your memories are there. You leave because you want to live. But leaving your country can feel like losing a part of yourself. And while these political struggles continued, Yahya Jammeh remained in power. For some Gambians, however, his government was not defined only by repression. This is another complicated part of the story. There were people who supported Jammeh. There were people who believed his government built infrastructure, expanded roads, developed institutions, promoted agriculture, and invested in certain areas of the country. There were people who genuinely believed that he had brought development. There were people who admired his confidence. There were people who believed that his strong leadership protected the country. History is rarely as simple as saying that everybody hated a ruler. Countries are made of millions of different experiences. One person can remember a government with gratitude. Another can remember the same government with fear. One family may say, "He helped our community." Another family may say, "He destroyed our family." Both memories can exist in the same country, and perhaps that is why understanding the Gambia requires more than simply choosing a hero and a villain. It requires listening to the people, listening to the victims, listening to the supporters, listening to the families, listening to the journalists, listening to the soldiers, listening to the politicians. Because history is not just what presidents say. History is what ordinary people remember when the cameras are gone. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a moment to subscribe. Remember, this is our first video and we are building this channel from the beginning. Our goal is simple: to tell Gambian stories, politics, history, sports, entertainment, culture, and the people who make the Gambia what it is. So subscribe, and let's build this Gambian community together. And now, let's go deeper into the story. Yahya Jammeh's rule also became associated with increasingly unusual and controversial claims. He presented himself as a strong leader with extraordinary abilities. He made controversial claims about medicine and healing. He made statements that shocked many people outside the Gambia, and his government became increasingly personalized around his authority. The country was no longer simply being governed by an institution. It increasingly felt to many observers as though the country was being governed by one man's will. That is one of the dangers of long-term political power. Institutions become weaker. Personal loyalty becomes more important. Criticism becomes more dangerous. And eventually, people stop asking whether a decision is right. They start asking whether the leader will be angry. That is when politics becomes fear, and fear can become a prison without walls. Then came another tragedy. The events surrounding the killing of Gambian migrants and travelers became another painful chapter in the country's history. There were families searching for relatives. There were accusations of killings. There were international investigations and demands for justice. Again, the same question returned. Where are our loved ones? That question would echo throughout the Jammeh era. Where are they? What happened? Who ordered it? Who knows the truth? And will anyone ever be held accountable? For families, justice is not an abstract political concept. Justice can be as simple as being able to bury your loved one. Justice can be knowing what happened. Justice can be hearing somebody admit the truth. Justice can be seeing the person responsible answer for what they did. And sometimes, justice takes decades. The Gambia would eventually reach another turning point. After more than 2 decades in power, Yahya Jammeh faced a presidential election. The opposition candidate was Adama Barrow. Many people did not expect the political system to change peacefully, but the election produced a result that shocked the country. Adama Barrow won. For a moment, it looked as though the Gambia might experience one of the most important peaceful political transitions in its history. But Jammeh refused to accept the result. Think about what that meant. A country had voted, the people had spoken. But the person who had ruled the country for more than 20 years did not want to leave. The situation became a national crisis. Gambians did not know what would happen. Would there be war? Would soldiers fight each other? Would civilians be killed? Would families have to flee? Thousands of people eventually crossed into Senegal and other neighboring countries as the crisis intensified. People left their homes. People carried children. People carried bags. Some carried almost nothing. A country that had once been known for its peaceful atmosphere suddenly found itself at the center of a regional political crisis. And the world watched. One more thing before we continue. If you have made it this far, you are one of the first people supporting this channel, and I genuinely appreciate that. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe now, because this is just the beginning. We have so many Gambian stories to explore. Some will be political, some will be historical, some will be about football and sports. Some will be about Gambian entertainment. Some will be stories about famous Gambians. And some will be stories about ordinary Gambians whose lives deserve to be remembered. So subscribe and stay with us. Now, let's finish this story. The Economic Community of West African States, known as ECOWAS, demanded that Jammeh respect the election result. Regional leaders tried diplomacy. They tried negotiations. They tried to convince Jammeh to leave peacefully. But he continued to resist. Eventually, military forces from several West African countries entered the Gambia under an ECOWAS operation. The possibility of military confrontation became real. And once again, ordinary Gambians were caught between political forces far larger than themselves. People did not want war. They did not want soldiers fighting in their streets. They did not want their children hearing gunfire. They did not want their homes destroyed. They wanted something incredibly simple. They wanted their country back. Eventually, Yahya Jammeh agreed to leave the Gambia. He went into exile. And the man who had ruled the country for more than 2 decades boarded a plane and left the country. For many Gambians, it was an emotional moment. Some celebrated, some cried, some prayed, some simply stood in silence. Because when a government lasts for decades, its departure does not immediately erase the past. Jammeh left, but the wounds remained. The missing people were still missing. The families were still grieving. The journalists who had fled still had to decide whether they could safely return. the victims still wanted justice. And the country still had to answer a difficult question: how do you rebuild a nation after years of fear? That question is harder than overthrowing a government. Changing a president can happen in one day. Changing a country's political culture can take generations. You have to rebuild institutions. You have to restore trust. You have to protect journalists. You have to protect opposition politicians. You have to make security forces understand that their loyalty belongs to the Constitution and the people, not to one individual. And most importantly, you have to confront the past. The Gambia established mechanisms to investigate human rights violations committed during Jammeh's rule. Victims came forward, witnesses spoke, former officials testified. Stories that had been whispered for years were finally spoken publicly. And for some families, hearing the truth was itself a form of healing. But healing does not mean forgetting. There is a difference. A nation can forgive without forgetting. A nation can move forward without pretending that nothing happened. Because if history is forgotten, it can repeat itself. This is why the story of Dawda Jawara and Yahya Jammeh matters. Jawara represented one era. Jammeh represented another. One came through civilian democratic politics. The other came through a military coup. One left power after an overthrow. The other eventually left after losing an election and facing regional pressure. But the real story is not about these two men. The real story is about the Gambia. The real story is about what happens when institutions are weaker than individuals. It is about what happens when soldiers decide that they should govern civilians. It is about what happens when a leader stays in power so long that criticism becomes dangerous. It is about what happens when people become afraid to speak. And it is about what happens when a country finally decides that fear cannot be its future. There is something deeply sad about the history of the Gambia, because Gambians have always been known for their warmth. The country is famous for its hospitality, for its music, for its communities, for people greeting strangers, for families gathering together. And yet, for many years, there was another reality underneath that warmth. People were afraid. They were afraid of politics. They were afraid of the government. They were afraid of the security forces. They were afraid of what could happen to their relatives. Imagine living in a beautiful country while carrying a terrible secret inside your heart. Imagine smiling at people during the day while worrying about someone you love at night. Imagine hearing the name of the government and immediately remembering somebody who disappeared. That is the kind of pain that does not appear in official speeches. It does not appear on tourism posters. It does not appear in photographs of beaches. But it exists. And that is why the history of the Gambia must be told. Not to create hatred, not to encourage revenge, not to turn one political group against another, but to remember the people who suffered, to remember the journalists who risked their lives to tell the truth, to remember the families who waited, to remember those who disappeared, to remember those who were killed, to remember those who were forced into exile, and to remember that democracy is not simply about voting. Democracy is also about what happens after the vote. It is about whether leaders respect the result. It is about whether citizens can criticize their government. It is about whether a journalist can publish an investigation without fearing for his life. It is about whether a mother can demand answers when her son disappears. It is about whether a political opponent can lose an election without becoming an enemy of the state. It is about whether a soldier understands that his gun belongs to the nation, not to a political leader. The Gambia's story is therefore a warning to Africa, a warning to young democracies, and perhaps a warning to every country in the world. Because democracy can look strong until the moment it is tested. Institutions can look powerful until someone decides to ignore them. Freedom can feel permanent until someone takes it away. And peace can feel ordinary until the day it disappears. Today, when people look at the Gambia, they may see beaches. They may see the river Gambia. They may see smiling people. They may see tourists. They may hear music. But behind that beautiful country is a history that deserves to be remembered. A history of hope. A history of betrayal. A history of fear. A history of resistance. And a history of people who refused to believe that their country belonged to one man. Dawda Kairaba Jawara's era ended with a military coup. Yahya Jammeh's era eventually ended with an election. Between those two moments lies one of the most painful political chapters in Gambian history. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this: no president is bigger than a country. No soldier is bigger than the Constitution. No government should be more powerful than the people. And no family should have to spend decades asking, "Where is my loved one?" The Gambia has suffered, but the Gambia has also survived. And survival is important, because the story does not end with Jammeh leaving the country. It does not end with Jawara dying in exile. It does not end with elections. The story continues with every Gambian who chooses peace over violence, with every journalist who chooses truth over fear, with every young person who believes that political disagreement does not have to become hatred, with every family that continues to demand justice, and with every citizen who believes that the future of the Gambia should never again depend on the will of one man. The saddest part of this story is not simply that a coup happened. The saddest part is everything that followed. The fear, the silence, the disappearances, the exile, the families broken apart, the years that people can never get back, and the questions that some families still carry. But perhaps the most hopeful part is that people continued to believe that another Gambia was possible. A Gambia where leaders can leave office. A Gambia where elections matter. A Gambia where journalists can speak. A Gambia where soldiers return to their barracks. A Gambia where political opponents can disagree without fearing death. A Gambia where children can grow up without inheriting the fear of their parents. That is the Gambia worth fighting for. Not through guns, not through coups, not through dictatorship, but through institutions, truth, justice, democracy, and the courage to remember. Because nations do not heal by forgetting their wounds. They heal by facing them. And perhaps, after everything the Gambia has experienced, that is the final lesson. Remember what happened. Remember the people. Remember the pain. But do not allow the pain to become the future. The Gambia is still here. Its people are still here. Its rivers still flow. Its children are still growing. Its music is still playing. And its story is still being written. May the next chapter be different. May it be written not by soldiers taking power, not by presidents refusing to leave, and not by families living in fear. May it be written by the Gambian people themselves, a people who deserve peace, a people who deserve freedom, and a people who deserve to live in a country where nobody has to disappear simply because they spoke the truth. And if you have watched this entire story, thank you. You have been here from the beginning. This is our first video, but it will not be our last. There are many more Gambian stories to tell, stories about our history, stories about politics, stories about sports, stories about entertainment, stories about culture, stories about the people who built this country, and stories about the people who are shaping its future. So if you believe these stories deserve to be told, subscribe to the channel, share this video with another Gambian, send it to your friends, start a conversation, because history belongs to all of us, and together we can make sure that the stories of the Gambia are never forgotten. Thank you for watching, and welcome to the journey.